Today's speaker is Cale Helmer. He's in corporate learning and development at Assent Compliance. I'm not a big fan of reading big bios, whether it's reading mine or reading other people's, but basically Cale spent the last 4 years in a training capacity at Assent Compliance, but even before that, 6 years at OnPath, helping from a training perspective, even before that. But outside of all that bio and things that you would see on LinkedIn for Cale, I'm interested, Cale, in knowing a little something about you that may not be on your resume, on your LinkedIn profile as an introduction here.
Sure, absolutely. First and foremost, thanks for having me, Rob. And guys, I'm welcome to the session today. I'm really looking forward to chatting with all of you. Christian, I'm curious as to what you're having for breakfast, of course, now that you've mentioned that to the group. One thing about me that you will not find on my bio per se, I used to actually test ride roller coasters for a living. So I worked for Canada's Wonderland for about 4 years when I was in university millennia ago. And part of my job was to test ride the roller coasters every day to make sure that they weren't crazy or going off the rails. So
that is amazing. I've never met anyone that test rides roller coasters in any capacity. And you know, you didn't know this, but I actually worked not for 4 years at Canada's Wonderland. I actually worked there for 4 hours.
Nice.
Quick story, I was put into one of those little places where you make popcorn, and that wonderful smell of popcorn is just makes you want to buy it. But when you burn the popcorn in a live amusement park environment, that does not smell very good. I lasted 4 hours and did not go back to Canada's Wonderland as a worker. I attended there in other capacities. And also, I have to ask before getting started, what's behind you? What are those items behind your head there?
So it's funny because I was taking a look at my work environment. I'm downstairs in my basement right now because my wife and kids are upstairs working and doing school. So I've got some Funko Pop figures that are behind me. I think this is part of the Star Wars collection. And then I've got a couple of my my posters up here from one of my favorite book series, which is the Dark Tower series by Stephen King.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. So one thing I'm actually just getting rid of a do not disturb there. Someone's trying to message me on a live webinar. This is a rookie mistake. I'm gonna just get that off there. But you know, one thing I wanted to just also find out was that in terms of your role, understanding what your daily kind of life looks and feels like there, just to get a sense of kind of what what you do on a daily basis, how you help companies when it comes to this topic. It'd be great to know as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Assent Compliance is an Ottawa-based company, and we actually do have global locations in the Netherlands. I saw somebody was coming in from Denmark, I believe. We've got some team in Amsterdam. We also have locations in Kenya and in the Philippines and in the United States. And so we have a fairly large workforce. It's about 600 employees altogether. My role specifically within the company is to oversee the corporate learning and development. So I have a team of trainers, sales trainers, customer success trainers, technical trainers, and they're responsible for the day-to-day education of our team and also for our external customers. My role is very much a coordination role. If I'm not actually in a classroom facilitating, then I'm actually prepping for facilitation, or I'm helping to audit classes, or I'm helping to actually put together lesson plans for the larger scope. And we are very active right now. We actually just did a 7-hour brand new onboarding training session for 3 new hires yesterday. So I'm pumped, I'm charged, and I'm definitely in the training zone.
Awesome. Love it. So I guess that being said, in terms of being in the training zone, today's topic, distance training doesn't mean you have to be distant. This is actually something that's really dear and near to my heart. I've spent 5 years, working remotely, but also 12 managing teams in that respective. It's always a struggle to train in those types of capacities. And what we do every month is we're bringing on great speakers with this level of knowledge and passion, quite frankly. So Cale, we're excited to have you here today to talk about this topic, which I think a lot of people are trying to wrap their heads around as well. So I'll leave the floor open to you. As mentioned again, and we give this quick kind of 5-minute intro, so we let everyone filter in. Please use the Q&A if any questions. Cale has given me permission to interrupt whenever I want, so it's nice to yield that power right now. But Cale, I'll hand it over to you.
That sounds great. Thanks again, Rob. I appreciate it. So folks, as we are all working from home, most of us right now, there are some potentials for interruptions. I'll apologize in advance if my dogs start barking because they hate doorbells and all that other fun stuff that goes with it, but we should be okay for the next little while. So the focus really on today's training is about distance training and trying to make that connection between an in-class environment and a remote environment, because all of our folks are now essentially moving to a remote capacity. So I want to start off with just a very, very quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at 4 key principles and some assumptions about adult learning theory. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you. I'm not going to put you to sleep. These are going to be very practical tips. Then we're also going to talk about ways that we can actually engage your remote workers, which is basically your broad learning base right now, and also some best practices that you can use to actually deliver remote training to your team. Now, some of you actually that are on the session today may actually be facilitators, instructors, and educators, and some of you may not be, and that's perfectly fine because these tips and approaches are actually applicable to any role that you happen to be in. If you're teaching to some capacity, then this session is definitely for you, and we certainly encourage questions to be asked throughout the presentation. So I do want to start off with a really quick overview here. This is actually a survey that was done back in February of this year before COVID-19 really kicked into full force, so to speak. And they were asking people, what is your biggest struggle with working remotely? And you can see here, the top two were actually collaboration and communication. I know that we're challenged with that sometimes with the technology that we have, but loneliness was actually a major factor in this. So some things that really were kind of shocking to me is that they found that the actual heightened risk for mortality increases if you are suffering from loneliness. And while this is not supposed to be a psychological breakdown of people's mental state, I think it's really important to understand that because we're working in a new norm right now, it's our obligation as leaders, as people who are actually educating other people, to not just teach them material, but to also connect with them on a very personal level as well. It's really important for us to be sure that people are aware of the fact that they're feeling lonely and that we can actually fix that very easily with very minimal effort. And that's kind of what that focus is going to be about today, is how to make those connections with the right type of people. The tough part is, where do you start? How do you actually make sure that you're connecting with people in the right way? So I want to show you this really scary graphic, first of all. My eyes bugged out the first time I saw this as well, too. This is actually a model of the learning theory landscape. And what you can see here in all these little different bubbles and squiggly lines here in this mind map essentially are different types of learning techniques that are actually in practice right now in business and in education. There's a ton of them. And it's really tough to kind of narrow down what it is that you actually should be focusing on. So to clarify, first and foremost, there is no right or wrong way. I really want to make that clear. If you take a different approach, by all means, please do so. Hopefully you've got success with it. But for us, we're actually going to focus in on a very small section of the learning theory landscape today. And that's actually to talk about the principle of what's called andragogy. You may have heard of it as androgyny. That's not it. It's not androgyny. It's andragogy or andragogy. You may have heard the term pedagogy as well too. And so essentially the fundamental difference between the two is that pedagogy is really about the education of children, and andragogy is about the education of adults. And that's really where that separation comes in. Now, there's a lot of differences as to what separates these two from a learning methodology perspective. But from our side of things today, we're actually going to focus in just on these four core principles of andragogy. And in a nutshell, really what they boil down to is that your adult learners want to be involved in the process. They need to be considered partners. They need to be considered people that are actually participative in that actual process itself. The other aspect to consider too is that adult learners' experiences, no matter how positive or negative they may be, actually contribute to how readily they are to adapt to new material, to accept new material, to be willing to actually involve that new content into their day-to-day activities. Your adult learners as well too typically are going to be looking at overall relevance and impact to their life. So if you're teaching them a subject, if that subject doesn't actually have bearing on what they should be doing on a day in and day out basis, you're going to get a lot of pushback. You're going to get a lot of people asking, why do I need to know this? And they may not necessarily be as readily adapted to learning new content. And last but not least, we're going to focus on the fact that adult learning is really problem-centered. It's not necessarily solution-centered. It's not driven by content. It's really it's really driven through the concept of how do I actually get the best possible result for me to ensure that I'm actually progressing and being successful in my current work environment. And that's the four areas that we're actually going to focus in on today.
I have a quick question before you dive on, and this might be a silly one, but you think about the adult learning versus the child learning. You know, I've had a couple of friends who are principals at schools that are now having, you know, teachers on a Zoom call like this who's never had a conference call in their life. So they're kind of taking it from a, you know, perception of a child, like this is a brand new skill or experience for them. Are there similarities in those two ideas in terms of someone doing something new as an adult versus the child theory? I'm trying to get a sense of any thoughts around that.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things is that when you're a child, you're pretty fearless, right? We take a lot of risks when we're kids. I know anybody of my friends that have boys, for example, young boys, they are terrified when they find out they're having a boy because inevitably it's going to lead to a broken bone or a bloody nose. Girls are just as bad. For the record, I've got one of each, so trust me on this one. What I will say though is that most younger children are pretty fearless at exploring new things. They're the first ones to go up and pick something up off the ground, to look at it, to taste something, to dive into something. As we become older, we have a tendency to put biases in place. And so we usually distance ourselves. So you make assumptions. Oh, I don't like this, so I probably won't like that, so I'm not willing to try it. As we start to shift this modality into remote work now, more and more adults are being forced to actually explore that almost childhood curiosity that they left behind long ago. They are starting to have to learn to use new technologies. They're now having to learn how to be integrated more into social media and stay connected. It's absolutely amazing to see people that are technically outside of the normal tech savvy generation starting to pick up on this stuff because they have time and effort to do it now. They're saying, hey, why not? Let's join the rest of the crew. So this is causing people to shift their prerogatives, if above anything else. And we're seeing more people become curious again, whereas in the past, they really, really weren't.
Yeah, I'd like to think that that was like an intelligent question by me, but it was sparked by the Saturday Night Live at home the other day where they did a fake Zoom call and people were trying to figure it out. That's where that came from.
So,
But
so true.
also, it was just a question around something about making the screen larger. It's hard to read the laptop screen. There is a way if you click on the actual screen to pin that so that that is larger. So hopefully you're able to figure that out in Zoom as well. And if there's any issues, our team can help you in the chat as well.
Excellent. Okay, let's actually dive into the first principle here, just to make sure that we're all on the same point. So the first one that I want to talk about very briefly is that adults need to be involved in the planning and the evaluation of their instruction. And what I've seen in my time working in training and development, it's now going on over 2 decades. A lot of junior instructors have this mentality of, I'm the teacher, you're the student, therefore you have to listen to me. And a lot of this comes from the fact that this is how they were taught. They go up through the school systems, and this is essentially how they're educated. We're seeing a lot more individuals and organizations, though, shift away from that and start to recognize that you're getting people from all sorts of different backgrounds coming into your work environment. Some of them have specialized skills. Some of them have more general or practical skills, but all of them bring experience to the table. And so it's really important as an instructor or a facilitator to be able to recognize what those experiences happen to be. In my organization, we actually teach a lot of young people, folks that are literally just coming out of college, still in college or university. They don't have a lot of job experience. And so it's pretty easy for us to sit back and say, well, what do you know? You've only worked as a bartender before. There's no possible way that you could understand the complexities of what we do. But these are people, right? They're people in the sense that they're navigating the waters of social distraction and social connectivity. They have a lot of interaction and a lot of experience that they can bring to the table. It's just a matter of being able to tap into that and learn how to leverage that information properly. So including them in this process, getting them to embrace those strengths and actually have conversations with broader people to share those experiences, that's a huge benefit for us. It really, really is. The other aspect that we have to be considered about when it comes to planning and the evaluation of instruction, a lot of organizations want to focus in on testing, KPIs, methodology. They want to see quiz results. They want to see survey results and test results, et cetera, et cetera. But it's really important to understand that gut feeling and gut reaction is sometimes the best success measure, depending on what you're teaching. Case in point, if I'm teaching a class, oftentimes I can look out into the sea of people and say, how do you guys feel about that? And I'll get the typical response. Okay, things are great. It's like asking my kids how their day at school was. It was all right. That's pretty much the extent of the conversation. Sometimes, though, you have to get a little bit deeper and you have to be willing to actually have those conversations and talk to people and say, okay, tell me about how you feel about this. More specifically, if I was to ask you to teach back what I just taught you right now, how comfortable would you feel? You are bound to get a guaranteed response that's a gut reaction. People are going to go, oh, well, hang on, I don't know about this. This is not something I'm totally comfortable with. That's great, because now I can help to identify where those actual gaps are, and I can include them in that learning process more to say, okay, how can we get you up to speed, and how can we make you feel more comfortable with this? But keep in mind, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. So as much as you want to have a plan in place to say, this is the structure that I'm going to follow every time I teach somebody, it's not going to work. Your Zoom meeting might crash. The doorbell might ring and the dogs might go crazy, right? You may have situations where people's internet connection completely drop off. You just have to be willing to roll with it. So a couple things that you should take into consideration just as a pro tip. Start off having learning strategy meetings with your students, right? With your employees. And they don't have to be formal. It's just a quick 5-10 minute conversation. Let's talk about what you want to get out of this today. Let's talk about what you want to learn and how you want to actually apply this. And then work with them to outline different learning objectives and measurable goals. Sometimes they're formal, sometimes they're informal. A case in point here, if you want to start using teachbacks in those lessons, try 3 different types of feedback scenarios. Demonstrate the basics to me, or explain a more complicated topic to me, or troubleshoot an issue like I was a customer. Get people to actually feel like they're walking through this in a real-time environment and not in a staged training environment as well. So the next slide to take a look at here is actually talking about experience, including mistakes, provides the basis for all learning activities. And as an instructor and as an adult, there are tons and tons and tons of times that I've made mistakes. And I'm readily able to admit this because I don't think my boss is on the call today. So I think that's fine. I can say I've screwed up quite a bit. The simple fact,
someone was heckling you in the background. So I don't know, it might be your boss.
It doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah, if it's not my family, it's got to be my coworker somewhere along the lines, which is great. I want to just start off with a really, really simple, analogy about this. I'm going to make the assumption that most people on this session today have probably made a grilled cheese sandwich in their life, right? And I can almost guarantee you that you've probably burned more grilled cheese sandwiches than you've actually made great grilled cheese sandwiches. If you're like me, you stand over the garbage with a knife and you scrape all the burnt off of it, but it is what it is. Now, you can tell a person how to make a perfect grilled cheese sandwich. You can tell them all of the right ratios of cheese to butter, the heat, all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, until you actually do it, until you actually burn your lunch to a crisp, you're not actually taking that experience out. But the next time you go to make that grilled cheese sandwich, you're going to think back specifically to that time where you literally set your kitchen on fire. Not saying that that actually happened, not at all. But if it did happen, you're going to learn from that experience. And so we want people to take those issues, those mistakes, those challenges, and roll them into the overall process. And you can see on the screen here, there's 2 different columns of different reasons for failure. There's quite a few: deviance, hypothesis testing, exploratory testing. What it really boils down to, though, is that actual mistakes are part of the iterative process when it comes to learning how to be successful in the training and development field. But there are a few things that I really want to clarify with this very quickly. This concept of fail fast and fail often, forget about it. Rob, that's to the Italian heritage right there. Forget about it, right?
Appreciate it.
What it really comes down to is that there has been this real push, this mantra of fail fast and fail often, be excited about it, learn from your mistakes. What sometimes happens, though, is that people take that at face value and they think, oh, well, if I fail, it's not a big deal. It's part of the learning process. Yes, that's correct. It is part of the learning process. But if you assume that that's the norm, it's okay for me to fail, that means that you're more than likely able to put out what we consider to be a minimum viable product. I'm going to do the bare minimum necessary because if I screw up, what are the consequences? It's not that big of a deal. And that unfortunately starts to roll into the broader spectrum. Your customer service teams don't necessarily take that time and effort to actually answer customer questions fully. Your sales teams don't take a look at that opportunity to upsell when there's an opportunity present because they think, well, I missed that opportunity, I'll just get it next time. So instead, we don't want people to think that it's okay to fail. We want people to understand that if you fail, it should be in an iterative capacity, which means you should constantly be looking at ways to adjust and to adapt and to actually build up on that skill set. A couple quick tips that I can give you in regards to that and how you can actually go about doing that. First and foremost, measure your progress. That is a major, major factor here. It doesn't matter how large or how small you think your progress is, it's still progress. And it's really important to be able to track that because in tracking your progress, historically, you can always look back and find out what it is you did or you didn't do that made you successful or didn't make you successful. You can leverage people like peer trainers to actually deliver content so that they can roll in their personal mistakes into this process. They can roll in their experiences so people actually feel like they're learning something from a peer as opposed to an authority figure, a manager, a trainer in that role. A couple other key points that I can give you in regards to this as well too. You should actually outline what failure scenarios look like. It's really important. You can demo an error like you would experience in your software. You can role play worst case scenarios. In fact, one of the wishes that I always give our on the phone representatives is I hope that that first call that you take on your first day of calling is the worst, most miserable, painful call you've ever had in your life. Because if you can get over that hump, you're immune to almost anything else. So take those experiences, roll them into everything. try fishbowling with larger groups of people to get fishbowl ideas going. Set up a large discussion in Zoom if you're using that, for example, and have people designated as the outer bowl and the inner bowl. Have the inner bowl run through these role play scenarios and run through these failure states and run through the experiences that they've had, and have the outer bowls actually look at how that information is being delivered. Get them to provide feedback, get them to provide anecdotal evidence, just get that conversation going so people feel that they're included and actually part of that overall discussion on the whole. So again, fail fast, fail often, but forget about it. And more importantly, don't think that everything that you do is prescriptive. Don't think that every response that you give or every lesson that you plan has to be in the designated lines. You know, sometimes coloring outside the lines really does produce the most beautiful picture. And so we want people to understand that adults don't necessarily follow this principle of like, I start at A and I finish at B. You might actually go up to C, you might go all the way over here to Z, and eventually you finish back at B. But that whole process has helped you understand what works and what doesn't. And so coloring outside of that prescriptive box can really help you yield some fantastic ideas. Get creative. And I hate that term, think outside the box, guys, but I'm going to say it, think outside the box. Get your people involved, get your people engaged in that as well, too.
A quick kind of question on that concept.
Yeah.
So if I think about, you know, experiential, that can't always happen in the, you know, in the goalposts of a training session, right? And clearly they have to go and do it and try it. And, you know, I think conceptually we know that that one day training session, you know, people are going to forget about it, go into, you know, their old habits or not absorb that information through experience. But any recommendation, and you might get to this, apologies if that's the case, Cale. But, you know, if I was thinking of going through this training, you know, world, understanding all their experience can happen in the, you know, in that training session, any other thoughts or concepts around, you know, how frequent things should be retrained on or updated on? I just want to get, because that's where I struggle sometimes is you can put people through training, but quickly going into bad habits right away.
That's a great point. You know, so muscle memory plays a large portion of decent training and keeping your skills sharp. And so there are certain skills that we have in place that we know we're utilizing every single day. How we type on a computer, you know, the phone calls that we make, the software that we navigate through, whatever the case happens to be. But there are other skills that we don't use on a regular basis. Case in point, we have some folks that work in more of a customer service capacity. Part of their job is upselling some of our additional customer base. This is a skill set that is outside of their normal day-to-day activities. And so when it comes time to actually see them use this skill, it's not uncommon to have people not use it properly or not use it as effectively as possible because it hasn't been polished. So just a general rule of thumb that we have kind of in the L&D space is that if this is a critical skill that you know is going to be necessary at some point in time, you should start the training as a ramp-up process. First and foremost, it's important to be able to say, okay, we know that this is going to go live, say, a month from now. So in a month's time, let's start looking at ways that we can upskill people, ways that we can actually drop the main content to them, and then ways that we can basically go back and drop little refreshers and tidbits so that it stays fresh and top of mind. From an actual impromptu perspective, just reaching out to somebody and periodically saying, hey, the last time we talked about this, we trained on X, Y, and Z. What was the one thing in there that you really didn't feel 100% confident on? Let's take 5 minutes and go back and talk about this. So it doesn't have to follow a formalized structure, but the challenge that most educators have is maintaining a recurring calendar, something that you can put into place to basically say, okay, on this day and at this time, I should teach this person on this thing. Don't beat yourself up if you actually miss that opportunity because you know, it's challenging to maintain that calendar. But the easiest thing that you can do is set a standardized cadence for yourself. So for me personally, I usually have a calendar set up. So every 2 weeks or so, I'm reaching out to different groups within the organization. I'm looking at the most quintessential things that they should know and that we've recently taught them. And I'm having very quick 15-minute meetings with these groups, micro training sessions to say, guys, let's talk about this thing. Let's talk about what's working, what's not working. And if there's something that actually doesn't get addressed in that main session, it then gives me the opportunity to go back, research it, and come back with a more formalized training session, but it still keeps that momentum going.
Yeah, actually, you reminded me of something I've seen a lot of our customers do, which has been valuable in that concept, especially when they're in multiple countries and not sitting in the same room. But it was the idea of a lot of our customers get a pulse of employees for engagement. How do they feel? What others do is these quick kind of pulse surveys to understand, do you understand concept A, B, C, D, you know, in the training that we just had, regardless of what it is. If they're struggling on it, maybe what they're struggling with, et cetera, telling some of those stories. But now it gives more of a holistic view where people may be stuck versus not, without having, you know, the inability of getting everyone in the same room together. So I thought I would share that because I've seen a lot of success with some of our our partners and doing those types of things.
That's a great point. And I think, we have to also respect the fact that people don't know what they don't know. And so you may ask a person, does this make sense? Do you understand this? And their natural reaction is going to be, sure, I do, because they don't want to come across as looking, weak or looking at uneducated. And the simple fact is that you have to be willing to call people out on that behavior. You have to be able to, put on your detective cap a little bit and say, all of these clues don't necessarily lead me to this outcome. They lead me to this outcome. And I suspect that you're probably not 100% comfortable with this. So what can I do as an instructor to help you stay up to date and up to speed, and then customize that training approach to make sure you're actually connecting with that individual? Remember that the large majority of your people are probably going to get these concepts right off the bat, but a small percentage are not going to. And as much as you're going to want to cater to that 80%, sometimes you have to spend a little bit more time focusing in on that 20% to make sure that they really understand it. Because if they don't, they're going to be the ones that drag down your performance at the end of the day.
Great. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Really good answers to all my questions. There's also over 150 people on this, and I'm still not seeing any Q&A. So let's make Cale work for this. Come on. If you have questions, definitely ask.
Put me to work, guys. I'm going to take a dramatic pause and have a sip of water here. That gives you time to ask a question. Okay, well, let's keep going here. If the questions come rolling in, I'm happy to answer any of them at this point. So let's take a look actually at this next section here, which is that adults are most interested in learning subjects that have immediate relevance and impact to their job or their personal life. So I think that this is actually a pretty solid example here. You obviously signed up to this session for a reason. Maybe it was because you were curious. Maybe it's because you work in this field and you wanted to see what some other guy had to say about it. Prove me right, prove me wrong. Doesn't matter. I'm always up for a challenge, of course. But at the end of the day, you're hoping to find things that are actually going to be applicable to your day in and day out activities. One thing that I do really want to caution you on at this particular point is that if you're not actually focused on the proper content, connection, and application of information, then inevitably somebody's going to ask you, so what? They're going to say, what's the point of this training? Why are you putting me through this? I've been, unfortunately, in a number of sessions, both as the student and as the teacher, where the message has not connected with the right people because there hasn't been enough substance and clout behind the meaning behind it. So it becomes a bit of a challenge. And I apologize in advance. My big fat dog just came to lay down beside me here. So
that was you didn't skip a beat. That was impressive.
No, I'm so accustomed to it. I usually sit on a little two-seater upstairs, and she's an 85-pound dog, and she likes to squeeze into the little tiny spot beside me and kick me to move me over. So I'm on her domain turf now, I guess.
All right.
So one area that I do really want to focus in on here is that because of the type of situation that we're in right now, it's also very important to understand that we're not just dealing with job skills. We're also dealing with life skills. How many of you can honestly and comfortably say that every single one of your employees that are working from home have the basic life skills necessary just to get by? How many people know how to cook? How many people know how to use an iron? What's an iron? How many people know how to take out the trash on what day it's supposed to go on? Like, there's very, very simple things that we tend to take for granted here. So what's really critical in this particular point in time is that if you're trying to teach for the sake of teaching, if you're trying to tick the box, so to speak, to make sure your training gets across, it's also equally critical to make sure that you're imbuing this training with your own personal philosophies and personal ideas. I can't tell you how much of a stress reliever it is to take 10 minutes out of a training session to talk about whether or not Carol Baskins killed her husband on Tiger King. Spoiler alert, she did, if you haven't seen it. No, I don't know if she did. I'm speculating at this point. But the fact is that if you're not actually taking that time to really help to educate people on things outside of just the 9 to 5, you're missing out on a massive opportunity here. And the other thing to take into consideration is that maybe you're not an expert in the field of woodworking or in the field of painting with acrylics, but I guarantee you somebody in your team is. You actually have an entire army of subject matter experts in your own backyard. And it's just a matter of tapping into their resources. Now, keep in mind, most of these people are not professional educators, and that's totally fine. We don't need them to be. Sometimes all it takes is for a peer to step up and say, I want to take 15 minutes to teach people how to do X, Y, and Z. And that's really going to not only help to promote that sense of connectivity, that sense of engagement, but it's also going to help boost morale as well, too. People are going to feel like they're actually part of a community and not just simply part of a classroom. So a few pro tips that I can give you here, like I said, adding in that non-essential work information or the personal information, it acts as a great palate cleanser in between subjects. So you can try things like trivia games and polling questions. We did a digital scavenger hunt the other day at work for Easter eggs. We strategically hid Easter eggs in our learning management system and in our intranet and on different channels in Slack, and we had people going through to try and find them. And the other thing too is don't be afraid to recommend personal stuff like a cooking channel on YouTube or a great movie on Netflix. Talk about a book that you've read. It's about that personal connection. And so at the end of the day, we want people to be able to say, yes, I understand this and I appreciate why I have to do this, but we also want them to understand what the broader account happens to be. And in this particular case, the broader account of why I'm teaching you this is not because I'm forced to teach you this, it's because there's a practical purpose behind this. And you, as an employee, provide a valuable skill or service to what we do as a company. So in order to make sure that you continue to do that, I want to arm you and educate you with the best information possible. But at the same point in time, I also want to recognize the fact that you're a person. And so I don't just want to have to talk about the newest iteration of the software demo that we've got. And I don't want to have to talk about the sales metrics and the KPIs. I want to talk about what you watched on Netflix last night. Let's talk about what you had for dinner. Have you talked to anybody through Zoom in the last little while? Make it personal, keep it connected, and you will have people that are actually going to be far more appreciative of the time and effort that you're spending with them, as opposed to just simply teaching materials to them.
I want to just dive in. There was actually one interesting comment before the question I think is relevant to this topic. One was a comment that said, I'm a corporate trainer. I've taken to recording my trainings and sending the links back to the trainees should they need to rewatch any portion. It also allows me to review my work after the fact and see where I can make improvements. And I think it's a good point. You might have leaders coming in and out of the organization or needing to be trained on that. And then this idea about immediate relevance to them. It may not have been relevant at the time, but they might need that skill set right away, and it's nice to click on. So I thought I would share that as a point made there. But another question, and again, I think it's relevant to some of the pro tips there, and you might bring it up later, was that if you're doing an educational webinar on Eventbrite, for example, versus a training session, you'll get a vast group of people, even with learning objectives. Any tips on how to still make relevant and connecting and engaging? So it may be above and beyond some of the pro tips there, but any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So one of the things that sometimes instructors find very challenging, of course, is trying to cater to the masses as opposed to the individuals. And so I had a training session yesterday with 3 people, so I could really customize my approach. I could really make sure that I was hitting all the right markers. But the day before, I had a training session with 44 people, and so it's very challenging to be able to say that my learning objectives and my approach are going to hit the needs of every single person in that room. And while I don't necessarily want to say that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, that's not necessarily the case. What's really important to understand is that you as an instructor can still actually address these key learning principles without necessarily having to cater to a demographic. So you can still get people engaged in a conversation. You can ask questions. You can poll the audience. Sometimes it's a little easier to do polling, especially on a session like this, because that means people don't have to speak up. They can just click a button. They can still feel like they're participating. The other element behind it as well, too, is that you don't have to stop being you. You don't have to stop being personable as well, too, whether you're talking to a large sea of people or 1 or 2 people. If you're infusing your own personal instruction, if you're infusing your own training examples, your own experiences, people are going to connect with you more as a person than they are as a talking head. And that's really what we want to get people to understand as well, too. You don't have to necessarily change your approach or your strategy. You just have to be cognizant of the fact that you're trying to reach out to a much broader audience. And so the dialogue has to be more team-centric as opposed to individual-centric in that case.
Great. One thing I might add, I'm not an expert in any case, but I run a lot of online and in-person events. And I have a rule when it comes to, I don't care what type of event, training, whatever it is, there's 3 things. It's educate, engage, and inspire. So if there's a part of education where people are actually learning something, that has to be a very important checkbox. The other one's an engage. So whether it's this, having people, shout out, what city they're in or please tell me what Netflix show you're binge watching because I need some help. But the ability to ask questions like this, I find there needs to be an engaging component in person, quick talk to the person beside you, let them know what you're here to learn or what you're most inspired by. But then the inspiration is that what are tangible things that you can take away to do in your team, organization, personal life, whatever it is. And then it's interesting when Cale and I first talked about, putting this on, it was about those examples, those stories that can be remembered, those inspirational moments that you might take in. And I love, Cale, even so far in the first kind of 20 minutes of sharing some of those examples. So that's one thing I've used, is always entertain, engage, and inspire is kind of the goal.
I love that. I might liberally borrow that moving forward, just to let you know.
I don't know where it came from. Steve, you can steal it. All yours.
Oh, good. I saw a chat pop up just a second ago, and it just kind of triggered something for me here. Somebody was mentioning the fact that a lot of their managers are really starting to feel overwhelmed with everything that's going on right now. And at work the other day, we ended up putting out this major newsletter to all of our employees that talked about different resources that you have access to, free courses that are being offered, different YouTube videos that you can watch, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at one point I piped in and I said, is this too much? Is this too much for people to process? Because we're constantly being inundated with people saying, we've got free content, we've got a free webinar, we've got a free video that you can watch. When does enough become enough? And I think that it's important, first and foremost, for individuals to be able to say, I've reached my capacity. I can't take any more information today. I need to actually disconnect and just go outside for a little bit. Practice social distancing, of course, when you do that. But I also think it's really important that managers and leaders within the organization understand that it is actually okay to not be okay. And at this particular point in time, sometimes people don't want to learn a new skill, and they don't actually want to have, connectivity. I have a colleague of mine who is going through some personal stuff right now, and she's rock solid from a professional perspective. But today, that rock solid facade broke a little bit. And we saw the person underneath, and it really just comes down to the fact that this is an unprecedented time. And so we have to be very conscientious that behind the employee, behind the badge number, there's still a person. So having those personal connections, having those personal one-on-ones with both your staff member and your larger team, even if it's just a 30-minute touch base in the morning to say, hey, how's your cup of coffee doing this morning? Did you guys see that sunrise today? It's that personal connectivity that we can't lose at this particular point in time, because we don't have access to it. We can't just walk to the company kitchen and grab a cup of coffee and talk to people along the way. So it's really critical that you do take that time to recognize what's important from a training and delivery perspective and what's important from a health and well-being perspective. And sometimes the health and well-being, quite frankly, needs to outweigh the personal training time or the professional training time. So don't be afraid to push back and say, guys, this is not the best time to train this. Let's move this out by a day or two, or later on into the afternoon, once people have had a chance to wake up and kind of get in that mental readiness state.
Okay. Yeah, I think the kind of the second part of that question too was any suggestions on how teams can feel connected via activities that aren't live sessions via technology. And I think the exhaustion isn't just in general of overload of information, but it's obviously being on these types of calls all day. Yeah. One thing I've seen companies do is say, listen, we know you have to homeschool your children and you have other things. If you can't make it, like, I get it. Like, it's very easy to record the session and give them the link later and do them on their own time as opposed to in sessions.
That's it.
So that's one thing I've seen. But any other thoughts on that, Cal?
Yeah, a couple things. Actually, just to piggyback off of that, one recommendation that I have is that if you are actually doing recordings and you are sending those out to people later on, if you can, take a couple minutes to put timestamps into that. So some of this information may not be applicable to everybody. They may only be looking for very key items within that training session. So if you can put timestamps in there, even if it's just documented in writing so people can jump to those sections of the video, they're still going to take out the best parts of the video without necessarily having to feel like they've got to watch the entire thing to start from start to finish. So that's one. The other thing too that you might want to consider is social gaming and gamification. This plays a huge role in what we do every single day. We have a subscription to Jackbox TV, for example, and so we'll often run virtual mixers where people can just kind of pop on whenever they feel like it, bring their beverage of choice, and we'll be running games on Jackbox TV so people can play like Quiplash, for example, and compete against their team members. And we definitely encourage trash talking at this point. It's a great way to do it. I've seen people running poker sessions. I've seen people doing wine Wednesdays. There's a lot of different things that folks can do where it actually just encourages you to be social without actually having to be work social. And that's really the important thing. Now, granted, we also recognize the fact that not everybody is a social butterfly. There are some people that are just quite happy to be introverted, and that's perfectly fine. So we have quieter options for individuals. We have painting lessons. We have book clubs where people can share recommendations to one another. And sometimes it's just as simple as, hey, I'm going to send you a quick Slack message to say, check out this book. It's really awesome. And that's the end of the engagement, but it still keeps people connected. That's really, really important. The other thing that I do really want to stress for a quick second here is don't be afraid to embrace your work from home status. As you guys know, my dog's sitting beside me on the couch right now. I have teenagers, mulling around the house at the same point in time. I'm surprised my cats aren't crawling on me. This stuff is going to happen. So just roll with it, integrate it into your day-to-day subjects. I can't tell you how happy it makes people when you hold up your cat or your dog to the video and go, oh, look how cute they are. It's simple stuff like that. You're a person before you're anybody else. So be a person, right? Connect with people socially.
Love it. So I know there's a bunch of questions, but I know that there's some really interesting points you want to get to, Cale. So I'm going to let you kind of take the, some concepts that you want to share, and definitely we'll get some more of these questions. We're doing good on time.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. So one of the last sections that I actually want to share with you, one of the fourth principle in this case, is that adult learning is problem-centered rather than content-oriented. I know oftentimes what happens, at least and speaking from an instructor's and a designer's perspective, when we first start building content, we have a tendency to just dump as much content in as possible and try and scale it back. Sometimes, though, that really is the wrong approach. And so this point that I have here, jet engine repair won't teach you how to fix a flat tire. What we have this tendency of doing is saying, I'm going to give you as much information as humanly possible on this one subject, and then I expect you to just naturally parse it out on your own. That's not always going to happen. Sometimes people don't have the capability of doing that. So what's really, really critical to understand is that, when we're dealing with andragogy in this particular case, it's really problem-centered. It's focusing in on this particular problem, and let's talk about different solutions that we can use to fix this problem, as opposed to here's all the curriculum and you need to know this from start to finish. So a great way that you can get that information across is by using a technique called chunking. The essential part behind chunking is to basically take your larger blocks, split them down into smaller bite-sized blocks, and then make some assumptions as to how best to teach that and how best to learn it. You can use things like the Pomodoro technique, where you're actually setting aside dedicated blocks of time to just focus in on this one problem and this one solution. I know for me, I sometimes get overwhelmed with all of the emails and the Slack messages and the Zoom calls that I've got in my calendar. And sometimes I just need to honestly disconnect and tell my team, hey guys, for 15 minutes, I'm offline because I'm just working on this one subject. That works for me. It doesn't always work for everybody else. But chunking helps me actually associate better time blocks in place so that I can actually focus in on that problem as opposed to just simply hitting my end goal. If my end goal is today, I want to get through all the content, congratulations, you're probably going to do that, but people aren't going to take anything out of that. So you really need to focus in on today, I want you to take away one or two of these key items, and then we can address these other things a little bit later on down the road. So it's important to really focus in on the fact that when you are looking for a solution, you're trying to not only fix the problem right now, but you're also trying to put some preventative measures in place so that it doesn't reoccur moving forward. And that's really how adult learners gravitate towards this material, by asking them questions. What do you think about this? How would you solve this situation? Most of us get case studies sent to us on a regular basis. And some of these case studies are fantastic. Some of them, quite frankly, are just garbage. Some of the best ones that I've seen used in a training environment are case studies that actually have practical examples, but they don't have a solution. They're left open, and they talk about that in the group. How would you fix this? If you had carte blanche and you could do anything you wanted to actually get this customer their resolution, get this sales team motivated, what would you do? And no idea is a bad idea. So really, really want to stress that. The other aspect behind the concept of problem-centered learning as well too, is that it actually promotes what we consider to be self-directed learning. And in self-directed learning, your participant, your learner in this case, is actually proactively going out and they are looking for information. They're pulling down resources. They're going out to their colleagues and asking questions. They're also taking time to evaluate how they've done in comparison to how they've done in the past. We are our own worst critics. We have a tendency of always telling ourselves that we're doing a terrible job. So trust me when I say, when we ask people to do self-evaluation, they either score themselves exceptionally high or exceptionally low. There's usually no middle ground. What we're really trying to promote with self-directed learning is for that person to take those two extremes and start to go, okay, I'm actually really good at this, but I'm not so great at this. So let's find that problem solution right in the middle and find common ground. So take that time to really look at your training that you're going to be giving people and ask yourself at the end of the day, what problem are they trying to solve? Am I simply giving them material that they have to regurgitate later on? Or am I actually giving them an opportunity to look at this material and say, I have a question about this, I can find a solution to this, and now I can teach other people on how to fix that solution moving forward.
Awesome. Pomodoro is a tomato in Italian. So I've been trying to learn my nonna's Pomodoro technique for 4 decades now, and I'm failing miserably, but we'll still try and make all that tomato sauce.
That's incredible. My wife is a chef by trade as well too, and so she loves it when I cook for her, but I'm always dramatically intimidated anytime she stands in the kitchen and watches me. And anytime I think I'm out cooking her, all she has to do is pull out the knife and the knife sharpener and start doing this to it, and then I realize I'm totally out of my element.
That's funny because my Nona just holds the wooden spoon and then I'm done. So
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Sounds like you got a good Nona, that's for sure. So like I was mentioning in the last slide, what do people really need to learn? How can they take away something that's more problem-centered, more solution-oriented in this case? There's really four things that I'm hoping that people can kind of take out of this lesson here. And the first thing is that adults really must want to learn in the first place, and they're only going to learn what they feel that they need to learn. And this is actually a really common issue with a lot of instructors. I've worked for organizations in the past before where they hand you, a phone book and they say, here's the training material, go teach people. And you find yourself flipping through chapter after chapter after chapter, and it's not resonating. You look out into the audience and you just see, glazed over eyes because people stop caring. So first and foremost, yeah, you can take time and actually ask people, hey guys, what do you want to learn about today? If I could teach you one thing right now about this project, what's the most critical thing that you want to learn about? That doesn't mean that you have to completely bypass everything else. It just means maybe start with the best part and work your way forward from there. Another point is that adults learn by doing. We've talked about this as well too. So the focus really needs to be on problem solving and not simply ticking the box. In certain environments, you might have the benefit of having a demo environment for your software. Maybe you have job shadowing where people actually get the chance to sit down and navigate the systems and talk with their colleagues. This is obviously challenging now that we're working from home, but it doesn't mean that it has to stop. If you're using software like Zoom or another type of telecommunication software, you can oftentimes set up those dedicated meetings where people can still share their screen, have conversations, listen to calls. It's super important to get people to be engaged and to be participative so that they don't feel like they're just sitting here watching a screen the entire time. The last 2 points here are that adults learn best in informal situations. They have to be both collaborative and they also have to be inclusive as well too. So whether or not you are the type of person that likes to hang out at the back of the room and just watch everybody else, or you like to be front row center asking all the questions during a training session, you still have to find a happy balance in between. This is why when you are having training sessions remotely, you're taking time to actually pay attention to those people who are participating the most and those who are participating the least. You also have to shift the dialogue a little bit so that if you have somebody who is talking the most, you can redirect their questions to somebody who's not as engaged. Hey, that's a great question. That's a really great question, John. Let's actually ask Mary over here what she thinks about that. Mary, what do you think about John's point? And you start to get them included in that conversation. I have a general rule of thumb in my classroom, which is if you're not participating, you're probably the first person that I pick on. And I mean that in the best sense, of course. I don't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable, but it's important to make sure that you're teaching and you're having conversations and you're not making it a rigid class structure. And then last but not least in this case, adults want guidance and consideration as equal partners in the process. So this class that I was teaching yesterday, I had 3 new employees. One was in BC, one was in Guelph, one was right here in Ottawa. None of them come from a background that would necessarily be what we consider experts in the field that we work in at our company, and that's perfectly fine. Because as we started talking and they started expressing some concerns about how am I going to learn all of this stuff, this is not my area of expertise, I started to draw out things like what type of jobs have you worked at in the past? What are some of the skills that you bring to the table? What are some of the challenges that you've seen in other types of jobs that you might be able to leverage in this one as well too? And probably the most important question that I could ask them during that training session is, guys, how do you feel about this right now? Is there anything that's scaring you right now? Is there anything that we can talk about? I know some folks are a little bit off-put about the whole touchy-feely approach to training, and that's fine. But I can tell you, if you are practicing things like emotional intelligence, it's really critical for you to ask questions about how people are feeling and how they're actually not just feeling on the surface, but how they're also feeling internally as well too, because that's going to help them really push those fears out and have you address those issues with them moving forward. So 4 simple takeaway points that you can give people that you can put into practice while you're going through. But I also want to respect the fact that sometimes, as I mentioned before, people don't know what they don't know. They may not necessarily understand where they can go to get a lot of this information and get things started. So I have 4 quick suggestions for folks if you'd like to actually take a look at some of these to spice up your next online training session. The first one is 51 virtual team building activities for remote teams. There's 24 icebreakers to start conversations, 8 best remote employee training programs and strategies, and a book that I highly recommend for people that are kind of both breaking into the field of learning and development or maybe experienced in this field and they just look for a refresher. The Learning and Development book by Tricia Emerson and Mary Stewart. Highly, highly recommended. It's a very, very simple read. You can get it on Amazon. Just don't expect 2-day Prime shipping on that one.
Awesome. Some additional references here for will also be there as well. So I guess, so we're looking, we have about 10 minutes left, and there's actually some good number of questions, about 11 or 12 there. So I want to dive through those. One thing I will mention though, just last thing from WorkTango, we have a couple of ones coming up, webinars. One is actually next week. It's actually the first time we've actually brought back a speaker, bestselling author Michael Bungay-Stanier, who's awesome. So if you want to sign up for that, feel free to. And we're doing another one on May 28th. For anyone right now is thinking of hearing the voice of employees when it comes to COVID or working home remotely, and navigating through that, there's some really good resources we'll send you as well. But what we did want to focus on is really kind of, the questions and some of the things that are on people's minds here. And one thing that actually I found interesting is the third point here about adults learn best. There was just I think it's a comment, it doesn't seem to be a question, but anything else you want to add, Cale? It says in online environments, it's difficult for everyone to be heard as frequent participants, because some people may dominate the conversation. So perceptions may be formed that the quiet ones are not contributing. I know you did mention maybe it is your duty to kind of not pick on those people, but get them involved in the conversation. Any other thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, it's actually a really great question as well too. I think that in a lot of circumstances, if we're training in more of a traditional classroom environment, you would automatically go into things like breakout groups. So you would put people into smaller groups. You'd be able to really kind of leverage that skill of those who are a little bit more introverted, maybe a little bit more thinking oriented versus those that are, say, action oriented and doers. You technically do have that capability in a lot of the actual online scenarios or online tools like this. Zoom, for example, has just recently introduced breakout rooms. So you can actually set up workstations for people and have groups come together that way. But for those of us that don't always have access to that type of technology, what's really important to ask yourself is, do my exercises actually come across as inclusive, or are they really going to put people into an us versus them type category? So if you're doing any type of exercise, it's really, really important to understand whether or not it does include individuals, whether it does require people to actually be part of a conversation, whether it requires people to actually participate in a group setting. A case in point that I can give you, if you do traditional role play settings, you're probably going to have one speaker, one listener, and then somebody who's observing. And that's great. That's with 3 people. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But if you're in an actual group activity where you're asking for people's feedback and opinions, inevitably you're going to have those individuals that take over that conversation. So instead, try and look for ways that you can actually include the softer spoken people in different types of exercises. If you're going to have individuals that are going to push that dialogue, the ones that come right out and say, I'm the leader of this group and I want to have these conversations, that's fine, let them run the show. But then take the time to actually integrate some of the quieter people and say, hey, Joe, do you have an opportunity, or could you give us the opportunity to maybe read through this section? Could you give us your thoughts on what this paragraph has to say? So you are calling people out, but you're doing so in a much softer manner. And that way they don't feel like they necessarily have to be up in front of the entire group. You can keep it personal and keep that conversation going as if it's just the 2 of you, as opposed to, say, an entire room full of people.
Great. All right, 6 minutes and a bunch of questions. We're going to do rapid fire here.
All right,
one that actually I want to ask as well is from Bridget. What is the recommended size or number of people that is ideal for a training session? Any thoughts there?
A lot of it's going to be dependent upon what you're teaching and the type of business that you happen to be in. But we have found personally that the majority of our training classes are usually beneficial if they're no larger than about 10 people per session. It definitely gives you the opportunity to network with people on a more one-on-one basis. We also are respectful of the fact that sometimes you just have to train because you have to train and you've got to get large portions of information out. But don't expect that you're going to get the same level of output with a class of, say, 50 to 100 people that you would with a group of, say, 5 to 10. So in my personal experience, I typically like to keep things at around 10, maybe max 15 people, and then run multiple sessions if you have to.
Great. There's another question about suggestions on navigating online to make sure everyone is able to contribute. I think we said a lot around that, but anything quickly you want to add potentially on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Any type of online navigation is tricky because you might necessarily be seeing the same thing that the other person's seeing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are understanding the way that that navigation works or why they're even doing it. So in this type of situation, especially if you're demoing software, for example, it's better to actually over-explain than under explain and just assume that people know what's going on. So if you are teaching a component of that, make sure you say, so let's tie this back into why you're doing this at this point. Let's actually talk about how this applies to your specific role. That way, when a person does this, they know that they are contributing for a specific purpose, as opposed to just being there to click a button because you've told them to click a button.
Awesome. I'm loving the interaction here. We're going to try to get through these all. If we go over, hey, we go over. But you don't have to stay. This is an interesting question from Laurel. An old adage about dealing with children who are challenging: don't scold them, find something they did right, and make a big deal about that. Can you talk about this theory at all, or using this theory?
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking on a personal level here, my son is actually on the spectrum. He has Asperger's, which is classified technically as autism right now, and it has always been a challenge for me as a professional educator to personally educate him as a dad. And there are days, trust me, there are days where I didn't used to be gray. Let's put it that way. So, and there's days where you sit back and kind of say, oh man, I wish this kid would do X, Y, and Z. I wish he wouldn't do it this way. But you also have to step back and recognize the fact that children and adults are not bad all the time. They're not bad people. Sometimes they make bad decisions, but it doesn't necessarily make them a bad person. And it's much, much easier to be able to capitalize on that and turn it into a positive. So for example, if, when he was little, if I came downstairs and I found him drawing on the walls, for example, my first natural reaction is going to be, oh crap, the kid's drawing on the walls and I've got to clean it all off, et cetera, et cetera. To reflect on that though, I can say he's creative. He could be sitting in front of the TV doing nothing, but he's taking time to actually draw and map things out. And sometimes you really have to work to look through those positives. I'm not saying it's easy. Lord knows it is not easy. But also one of the best ways that you can find a person's redeeming qualities is ask your colleagues as well too. If they have experience working with those individuals, sometimes you just need to have somebody else's perspective on the matter to be able to give you fresh eyes on that subject. And in asking those people for their opinions, you may actually be able to change your opinion on that person as well too.
Great. Talking about hair, Cale and I, when we last chatted, we did the opposite. We had giant beards, and I shaved for the first time in 12 years. I think, Cale, yours was like 6 years or something?
Yeah.
Awesome. Quick one here. So with Pomodoro technique, are you recommending 25-minute chunks of learning versus 1 hour or 3 hours?
Yeah, that's a tough question as well too. I've seen individuals use it in 5-minute techniques and 15-minute techniques. For me specifically, what I'll do is that I'll usually do 15 and 30-minute increments because the average adult learner can't stay focused for much more than about 15 plus minutes at a time. So first and foremost, thank you to everybody who stayed on longer than 15 minutes. I do appreciate that. But it's also based on your personal work styles as well too. Some people are completely focused. They put their headphones in, they put on some great tunes, and then they're dedicated and focused. But if you're like me and you're living with other people, it is a constant set of distractions here. So you also have to be able to adapt your style to your current environment. Take a look at the task that you have to perform. Identify how critical it is and how critical it is to the success of that project in order for you to get through it, and then allocate your time appropriately. And if you find that, say, a 30-minute chunk or 45-minute chunk is actually giving you too much time and you're twiddling your thumbs by the end of it, scale it back. There is no right or wrong approach to it. You set your own parameters for this.
Awesome. Someone asked if the collection of free learning resources will be put together for the team. We'll put that on the web page where you can get the slides and everything. You'll get a follow-up email on that. Interesting question here, and I know we're getting short on time, but we'll try to go through it. But I'm not a professional educator. I wanted to attend the session to learn some tips and tricks simply because now, given the change and work from home, I may need to train online at some point. Any specific tools, platforms you would recommend for use, or perhaps some to avoid? Also, any suggestions on pace of presentation versus pauses for interactive elements, polls, ask from audience?
Yeah, great question. Lots of layers on that one. So, all right, let me see if I can maybe package this out a little bit more. The best piece of advice I can give you in terms of technology or platforms to use, first and foremost, is that if you don't understand it, don't use it. It's much easier to find something that you feel comfortable and familiar with. That if you're accustomed to teaching things out of an Excel spreadsheet, I don't care how ugly it might look, use the Excel spreadsheet, because you're going to actually make sure that you're really connecting with the people. You're going to feel comfortable in doing so. First and foremost, everybody and their pet dog is going to try and sell you on a new platform right now. Don't buy into the hype, right? It's all gaslighting at this point, so don't buy into it. Find things that work for you and take time to actually analyze what is going to work for your training and what's not. And if you don't have a fancy dancy tool to start with, that's okay. Don't worry about that. In regards to other tips and tricks when it does come down to training people, keep in mind, guys, that the only time people are really going to judge you is if you give them a reason to judge you. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when they're training for the first time is they say, oh, this is my first time doing it. I've never really done this before. Well, congratulations, you've just set yourself up for failure because you've told people that you're going to screw up. And now people are going to wait for you to screw up. You have to be confident. You've got to walk in there like it's your first day on the job, but you've got 50 years of experience behind you in order to run those sessions. So don't hesitate to take time, pace yourself and be open with people and say, hey, let's take this to be a little bit more informal. Let's talk about this first, as opposed to let's follow a structure and a rigid approach. Even with some of the formal demos that we're doing for our customers right now, we preface everything by saying, guys, we're working from home right now. There's bound to be some hiccups. We really appreciate you taking that time to respect the fact that we are working from home right now. We'll just kind of roll with the punches as we go. And the customers love that. They're super receptive of it because they are in the exact same boat that we are as well too. So be personable first, be a trainer second.
Love it. I love this question from Dean. What are Cale's favorite ways of engaging a virtual audience?
Well, I would say don't wear pants, but that's probably not the appropriate answer. Well, pants are definitely required. Actually,
Are they?
Ways, yeah. Well, we'll see. I may or may not be wearing pants today. I'll keep that open for the audience to guess. That's a poll question right there. Is Cale wearing pants? One of the questions that, or one of the things that I tend to try and do in these situations is I always take the first, 5-10 minutes of any training session just to talk with people. Hey, how's it going? Hey, did you guys watch that last episode of Tiger King the other night? What's this weather doing right now? Rob, you and I were talking about the fact that it was snowing here earlier today, which is crazy, absolutely nuts. So be personable to start off with. The other way that I keep people engaged is that I make sure that my lessons are broken up into microsections. I never will teach a lesson longer than about 45 minutes at a time because people get antsy, they get squirrely. And it's okay to be able to say, hey, you know what, guys, let's take a quick bio break. Let's go grab a cup of coffee. Let's do that. Sometimes I'll actually pick my computer up and say, I'm going to take you on a virtual tour of my house. Let me walk you to the kitchen. Let me show you where the coffee is. I often show people that my dog is sleeping beside me as well, too, because at the end of it all, people need to feel that personal connection above everything else. And don't hesitate. If you find that things are just not connecting with people, if the training just sucks, if it's not working out well, don't hesitate to be able to say to your internal employees, guys, you know what? I don't think this is working right now. Here's what I want to do. Let me take this away for the next 10, 15 minutes and work on fixing it. I'm going to try a couple different solutions on this. Let's jump back on this call in 10, 15 minutes and try it again. We'll take a completely different approach to things. People do appreciate that. They would rather have you admit that maybe it's not the best training possible than push through it, as opposed to just simply, dumping content on them that may or may not stick with them at the end of the day.
Gotcha. All right. So I want to be completely respectful of time. There's still also about 90 people here, but it's 2:04. If you could stay till 2:10 and we answer these questions quickly, sure. Why not? If you can do it.
Let's go for it.
Done. All right. This is a quick one. What type of break should we include in a 1-hour training or webinar?
So if I'm doing a 1-hour session, what I will do is I will normally ask people at the beginning if they feel the need for us to take a break partway through. You have to remember that even if you only assign a 5-minute break, the first couple minutes leading up to the break, people are going to be distracted because they know a break's coming. And the first couple minutes after the break, people are going to be slow to get back online. People will take longer to get back online. So personally speaking, if it's a 60-minute session, I recommend just pushing through it, unless it's really content heavy stuff, and then do about 30 minutes worth of training, about 5 minutes worth of break, and then take the remaining 25 minutes to kind of push the rest of the subject through.
Glad you said no breaks, because we have no breaks. What about overcoming some of the different personalities, troublemaker, naysayer, or overachiever? Ooh.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good one. I think I've probably been slotted into each one of those categories at some point in time in my life. You know what? The reality of it is that you are always going to have these personalities in your classroom, regardless of how experienced you are as a trainer, or what type of content you're teaching. And so the application of how to deal with these individuals in a virtual setting is very similar to the same if you were in person. And it is okay to actually sometimes put your foot down and say, Rob, I really appreciate these questions right now. These are fantastic. Here's what I need you to do for me. I'd like you to document these in a separate spreadsheet, send them over to me individually, because I don't necessarily know that they're relevant to the entire group at this point. Could you do that for me, please? And get their buy-in and get their commitment. People don't want to derail your training session as much as you may think they want to. And a lot of the times people's behavior is unknown to them. They don't realize that they're being disruptive. They don't realize that they might be a jerk. It's just part and parcel of who they are. And what they do require is somebody to say, you know what, just want to take a time out here for a second and let you know there's all this content to get through in a short period of time. So let's put a pin in this. Let's get you to write it off separately. I'm happy to engage you after that fact and address them on that personal level and then go back to the rest of the group.
Awesome. Quick review of fishbowling and when you'd use that technique.
Yep,
and says,
absolutely.
thank you, great session. So it's a lot of positive feedback coming in.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Fishbowling is typically used when you're doing a group dynamic exercise. So if you are trying to get individuals to demonstrate a skill, role play, for example, if you're trying to get people to actually show how to navigate through a system of record or maybe troubleshoot a situation, what the fishbowling technique allows you to do is have people in the center of the fishbowl actually do the action, participate through that, and the people on the outside of the fishbowl are your observers. Think of it as you looking into a fish tank, watching all those fish swim and do their own thing. When the exercise is done, an outer fishbowler is responsible for being able to give anecdotal feedback and evidential feedback as well too, to say, I noticed that when you moved from screen A to screen B, there was a lag here. Here's a couple tips and tricks as to how you can make that more smooth. Or I noticed that when you're having a conversation, you tend to rely more on crutch words like or or like. Try filtering those out of your dialogue. Here's a few examples that you can give. The people inside the fishbowl have got to be ready to be critiqued first and foremost, but the people outside that fishbowl have got to be ready to be the ones that are doing the critique and then be prepared to be put inside the fishbowl and have people critique them as well too. So you have to set the mental state before people just dive right on into it.
This is a safe space. We're all in it to learn and get better.
We are all fish in a bowl.
I thought this was an interesting question as well. How do you convince the business that training and development needs to answer the so what question so that training is not a tick the box?
That's a great question. This is also a question that I've been, trying to answer myself for most of my professional career. At the end of the day, training and development is a cost center. We cost money. We typically do not directly make revenue for our companies. And so anytime we do training, there's got to be a viable dollar output that shows based on what we've done. So one of the first things that you should be able to do is take a look at how you're formally surveying your learners. If you're not familiar with how to do proper survey techniques, there's a lot of different websites out there. I would recommend starting maybe with Kirkpatrick model and the 4 levels of Kirkpatrick methodology, because that'll help you understand how you should be asking questions to your participants and what you should be doing with this feedback so that you can adjust your training sessions. But more specifically, it's really important to be able to try and quantify the work that you're doing. And this is hard because training oftentimes is qualifiable and not always quantifiable. So an example that I can give you is that we take a look at our new hires that come in from a sales perspective, and we've recently changed the way that we're actually training them. We took our training, which was typically 15 days, and we scaled it down to 5 and then broke them off into smaller groups to do an additional 10 to 15 days worth of training. We changed the dynamic of that. Then we took a look at the actual metrics that were associated with that to see if there was any uptick in that person's performance, time to first sale, how quickly they close things off. And I'll be perfectly upfront and say, we saw zero difference the first time we did it. And we were really put out by that fact. We'd done all these changes and, everything just wasn't working the way that it should. But then we started questioning why. Why have we not seen changes? And that allowed us to dive deeper into the overall process that people were taking to learn the ropes. And what we found was that there was gaps in the production side of things that we weren't addressing in the training side of things. And so by partnering with those individuals, we were able to find where those gaps were occurring and actually tighten that training environment. So there's a lot of different ways that you can basically show your value. It helps, quite frankly, if your leadership team is behind training. So one personal tip that I'll give you, find one person within your executive team that becomes your internal champion. If you have somebody in there that can help champion your training initiatives to the larger executive team, you're set. Get yourself a sponsor. It makes a huge world of difference.
Awesome. All right. So I'm going to respect, first cardinal rule, I didn't respect everyone's time, and it's 2:10. So I apologize for that. And thank you, Cale, for staying a little longer. I will apologize. There's a couple of questions we just won't get to, unfortunately, today. But last thing is just a quick thank you for the WorkTango community and folks that came today and were really interactive. I think it makes for a good conversation. And also, Cale, just thanks for donating your time, your insights. I thought it was phenomenal in terms of just some takeaways to take back into this new environment we're in, and really appreciate it. Thanks so much. We'll see you all, I'm sure, in next week for the folks coming to the next one, but a lot of really good positive feedback from everyone as well. So have a great rest of the day, everyone, and then stay well and safe. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.